Everybody's ready? Okay, we'll reconvene the public hearing on Senate Bill 538 and ask the prime sponsor to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the Senate Election Law and Municipal Affairs Committee. For the record, I am Senator Rebecca Perkins-Quokka from Senate District 21, the City of Portsmouth, and the towns of Durham, Lee, Madbury, Newcastle, Newfields, Newington, and Newmarket. Today, I am introducing SB 538, an act relative to zoning procedures concerning residential housing. So I understand that the bill was introduced, and thank you to my colleagues for recessing the hearing until today. I think it was great to be able to be here, and I appreciate your help. As you know, our state is in the midst of a crisis. Not only are there not enough housing units readily available for New Hampshire families, but the costs of those units are simply becoming too unattainable for the average citizens. For years, circumnavigating the crisis has been one of my main priorities to ensure that New Hampshire can be a place that future generations can call home. I'm calling SB 538 Homenibus for that reason. It is a 5-part bill that offers some multifaceted solutions to start to address the dire situation our state is facing. We all know there's no silver bullet to solving the housing crisis. We'll need to use as many tools as we can and put as many tools in our municipalities' hands as we can. It is largely an enabling piece of legislation, respecting that our cities and towns are really the ones on the front lines of solving the housing crisis. I'm happy to walk through the bill piece by piece, if that would be most helpful, and just kind of introduce what the concepts are contained in here. So to open, we have, starting in section 2, a local tax credit option. So this would be something that municipalities can enact if they choose to, which would create a local tax credit for the conversion of downtown office space that they, no longer view as being heavily occupied to residential space. This would have to be in conformance with local zoning. It does not propose any changes at all to local zoning, but when the city or town chose to enact this local tax credit, they would need to define the downtown area that would be eligible for this conversion tax credit. The second part of the bill, which starts in section 5, is to enable our select boards to enact zoning ordinance amendments. And so this is something that would allow for the incredibly complex topic of zoning to receive more public understanding. As many of you know, a lot of our cities and towns are SB2 towns, and they, well, not cities and towns, just towns, they only have one chance a year, really, to consider major ordinance changes, and those are brought before their legislative body, which is the public at large. And so zoning is very complex. It's a lot of text. It's a lot to try to understand. It can be very personal to people. I mean, this is where they live, and it is something that should be dealt with carefully, and I don't think anyone in this room would disagree. And so enabling our select boards to be the ones to consider zoning ordinance amendments would allow for greater public hearing. It would allow for longer timelines. It would allow for more public discussion. It is something that any select board could do now by converting to a town council. And so the hope is that this would result in more municipalities having access to the local tools that would assist with creating greater housing supply. Third, which starts in section 7 at the bottom of page 2, we have a change concerning lot size requirements, and I know there's been a decent amount of discussion about this section, and so I think we have a slight tweak available if that's something that's going to address some of these concerns, but it's essentially allowing that we consider some new best practices, and instead of just picking like an arbitrary lot size, like an acre or 2 acres, we use existing DES guidance to ensure that we're using our land most efficiently, and that we consider the type of soil available when we're creating lot sizes at the local level. The fourth part, which starts in section 8 at the top of page 3, is essentially, it is a requirement, but it's only a requirement to consider. So it asks that our local land use boards look at parking alternatives. So when we talk to developers and when we hear feedback from developers, a very big hurdle to producing new housing is the cost of providing on-site parking. And so by allowing for some creativity and innovation, this section of the ordinance says that if, you know, an alternative parking solution or off-site parking solution is brought within certain criteria, that the local board has to take a look at it. And I'll give you an example. In Portsmouth, we had a downtown space being converted to 3 units. There were only 4 parking spaces available on site. One of the solutions was to lease a couple places in the local parking garage. And then last is begins with section 9 on page 4. This is the inclusionary zoning piece. The concept here is very similar to that which we all discussed in SB 224, but I know in that case that the drafting was just, it was confusing. And so we tried to just revisit this concept in a different way and enable local adoption of zoning ordinances which could require income restricted units as part of any new construction. And so the piece of legislation in front of you doesn't require anything, but it would enable a zoning ordinance that could have requirements in it. And so with that, I'll probably stop, and I'm happy to take any questions. I know there's folks behind me that have been very involved in this legislation as well. That will probably help with questions, but it's a technical bill. It's intended to be focused on what we're hearing for feedback and places that we can sort of move the needle, and so happy to work with anyone on the language contained herein.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you. A lot of big bill, a lot of pieces.
Yes.
I like a lot of it.
Great.
Line 6 on page 1
Yep.
limits it to tax credit to conversion from office use to residential use. Any feelings about opening that up to commercial or even industrial space?
So rather than limiting the conversion from office use to residential use, include office, industrial, or commercial space into residential?
I mean, we've got a problem right now with a lot of extra commercial space in a lot of cities and towns, and that space is easy to convert. It's not overly expensive to convert.
Yep.
You know, why not let the market sort of handle that and encourage it a bit? So
I like the suggestion.
I'm asking if you're open to that.
Yeah, I am open to that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Senator Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Similar question, but also any thought on maybe some motels or hotels?
Hotel or motel use. Good suggestion. Thanks, guys. I'm open to that. Yes,
Being
sir.
no other questions, I'll ask questions.
Yes, Chairman.
All right. Master plan, you know, some of those changes and even the changes suggested here by the senators may not conform with the master plan, okay? You know, allowing the selectmen and not at the town meeting to do these changes can certainly affect the feel of the community, okay? So I see pushback, you know, from some towns to saying, hey, you know, this is ours, you know, we don't want to give up that. How are you going to deal with those kind of things, you know, if we do all this?
Yeah, it's a big question, right? So I've been working on this issue for over 15 years at this point, and in a lot of detail. You know, when I was a city councilor, I worked on zoning changes in Portsmouth, and it took about 2 years to pass them, but we passed them. And there was a lot of community conversation around where does this fit into our city? You know, how should we plan these areas? How should we plan these areas? And it was part of a larger conversation that was going on about the shape of the community. But I think to your point, these conversations are best had at the local level. And so if making a change to who adopts the zoning ordinance from town meeting to the select board allows for more of that conversation and allows for consideration of whether it's in conformance with a master plan, I think that can only be a good thing. I know one thing we've considered is that the planning board usually is responsible for the master plan, and so there could be an option to include in here a requirement that such zoning ordinance amendments are referred to the select board by the planning board. And so, that way there's additional public process that ensures kind of the right eyes are on it. But I guess, in my mind and in my experience, which granted is not as much as everybody in this room, but, I just think that local conversation is the best way to arrive at a solution that people really want for their own city or town.
Again, if there was a ordinance passed, or I should say a warrant article, at the town meeting that says, oh, yeah, we want to give this responsibility to the selectmen, that would give me, better assurance that the town, has done something to enact this, okay? But just to take it away from the voters, and give it to the selectmen is not something that I would think that most small towns would want to do.
So I will point out to you, Chairman, that I believe that's how it's structured, is that
If it is, my quick reading of it,
I know this is
something about
it's a
Woodsville,
big bill.
it's causing me some problems.
Yep. So I'll point you to on page 2, lines 16 through 21. Any non-charter town, village, district, or county in which are located unincorporated places may adopt the provisions of this section by placing the question on the warrant of a special or annual meeting by the governing body or by petition pursuant to RSA 39.3. Upon adoption, the local governing body shall be authorized to adopt amendments to local zoning ordinance. So through that procedure, the legislative body, which is, the public at large, transfers the authority to the local governing body, which would be the select board.
And the problem that I had when I read that is,
Yep.
This says non-chartered town,
Yep.
okay?
Yep.
It's, could there be a chartered town out there that still retains that right? Again, that's,
Yep.
I
Yep.
mean,
Good question. Yep.
so,
Okay.
that's the end of my question. Senator Abbas, I thought I saw your hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize if you provide this information testimony. As I casually
There's a lot of words
walked
here.
in late, so I do
Okay.
apologize. But on page 3,
Yep.
lines 3 through 6, can you maybe explain what the scope of that provision is? Like, when would that apply, when would it wouldn't?
I could try, but I'd rather have some of the folks behind me answer that question if it's all right. Because I have some understanding of this, but I know there's some tweaking that's been in discussion that I haven't fully been a part of, so I just would rather have them answer if that's.
And then just to follow up on the question that the chairman asked about whether it's the local governing board that has the decision to adopt this, or whether it can be something that can go on the ballot.
Yeah.
What's the rationale for taking it off the ballot? I know, just an example in Salem,
Yep.
we recently switched to a town council from a select board.
Yep.
And if the town council were to adopt any type of zoning ordinance change, it can be challenged by, you can petition to challenge it on the ballot by getting a certain, and it's a fair amount, I think it's like 500 signatures, so you'll need a lot of signatures to do it. 30,000 people live in the town, so it's not as much as that may sound, but it's still, it could be done. Where, I guess, what's the procedure here if a town were to adopt this, the local governing board, what do the voters of those towns have as a remedy?
Well, they'd have the same remedy that you would have with the city council today, right? I mean, there's accountability at election time, but the hope is that by the logic for taking it off the ballot, the hope is that by creating more opportunity for discussion outside of the one town warrant meeting, that actually you've fostered the ability for everyone to have input, for everybody to interact with their, elected official, whether you're at large or by ward, and that the concerns are sort of heard and aired and worked out through the public process, just like we do here.
Well,
Yes, sir.
the problem I can see happening is although there may be accountability at the next municipal election, once a person's granted property rights, it's kind of hard to take them away. It would otherwise amount to a taking at that point.
If I may, yeah, I think there are concerns there. I think sort of the issue of spot zoning might be something you're sort of talking about, but generally, zoning ordinance amendments, I think, try to be broad and, part of a master planning process. And so to the chairman's point, the idea here is that, all of our cities and towns are thinking about these issues. And so, to the extent that right now it's difficult to draft a succinct warrant article, put it on a ballot once a year, get enough information out to the public to understand it and try to pass it, and that all of that is standing in the way of a goal that I think so many of us share, which is, to make sure we have these multi-generational communities that have the workforce that we need for our entire economy, where we have enough children to pay for the infrastructure in our schools. We have people to bring in groceries, shovel sidewalks, and run for town council. I think that the experience is that that's a really difficult process right now for the majority of our cities and towns. And so I keep saying cities and towns, for the majority of our towns. And so can we alleviate some of the pressure on that process by opening it up to additional public hearings and public discussion?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Seeing no other questions, thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you very
Will
much.
Stewart?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Will Stewart, and I'm the Executive Director of Stay, Work, Play New Hampshire, which is a statewide nonprofit whose mission is to attract and retain more young people here in the Granite State. And this is important for a number of reasons. One, we're the second oldest state by average age in the country. Even pre-COVID, and certainly now, we have one of the lowest unemployment rates, in the country. And, to top it off, kind of the trifecta, we are the #1 exporter of high school graduates who want a 4-year degree. Nearly 2 out of 3 leaving the state. Some of them come back, a lot of them don't. So to put it succinctly, we need more people here in New Hampshire. We need more young people in particular to fill those workforce needs that Senator Perkins-Quokka mentioned, the folks in our communities, the volunteers to shovel those sidewalks, to take in the groceries. We need people. And at Stay, Work, Play, we've been going all around the state these past couple of months talking to young people. In addition, last year to collecting survey in a very quantitative fashion as well. But as part of our series right now, where we're going around the state, our Policy and Pint series, talking to young people, we hear over and over again, in Coos County, we hear it in the Monadnock region, we hear it in Nashua, we hear it all over, is housing, housing, housing. That is the #1 issue, facing young people, and the biggest cost that they face here in a very high cost of living state. So that's a long way of saying that we are very much in support of Senate Bill 538 and encourage your support as well. Happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mrs. Cushing and Wynn. We'll bring you both up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senators, for having us this morning. My name is Ben Cushing, and I'm a Realtor. I'm a 30-year veteran, been in the trenches. I was the 2023 New Hampshire Association of Realtors State President, and we are here on behalf of support of Senate Bill 538, with one exception, and Bob will talk about that exception. There's no need to keep talking about the issue, and he just mentioned the word. It used to be location, location, location. Now it's housing, housing, housing. I just did a search yesterday. I'm also a broker in Vermont, and between the two states, there's less than 1,900 residential homes for sale as of yesterday. and in New Hampshire, there's less than 1,100, which is kind of a crazy stat. And we have some stats here that in January of this year, there were 1,300 homes for sale, and back in 2019, there were 4,100. So there's a big difference. So you can see that's a 67% drop in that time frame. Senate Bill 538 could help change this and ensure some New Hampshire families and workers the ability to find housing in our state. The legislation encouraged the adaptive reuse of older and unused commercial space, transforming unused commercial space into housing. This is a trend that could help alleviate our inventory shortage while utilizing an existing building footprint that we currently have in many of our cities and towns. However, converting some of these structures into housing oftentimes present unique and expensive challenges, which can make the housing units unaffordable to some. Altering 79-E tax benefits is entirely reasonable and a useful tool for both municipalities and developers. Section 3 is a long overdue update to zoning. The purpose of minimum lot sizes for housing was originally introduced for several reasons. One, it was to ensure appropriate availability for room of septic systems as well as replacement fields when one of those was eventually needed. And two, it is to ensure appropriate distance between septics and drinking wells. And over the years, minimum lot size requirements have expanded well beyond the need for septic systems and/or drinking water. Allowing smaller lot sizes and more density would slow down rural land development and simultaneously make new housing affordable. Some of you may have just watched the Super Bowl a couple weekends ago, and they played on a field that was 1.3 acres in size. And so do many of our towns really need to mandate a lot size of a football field for a single-family home? And in many cases, towns mandate 2 or 3 acre lot sizes, and this would be about the size of Fenway Park for a single-family residential home. Keep in mind, any development would have to comply with existing property line and wetland setbacks, as well as all of the town building ordinances, as was stated by Senator Perkins-Quokka. Finally, Section 8 provides for alternative parking solutions for development. As some have said, the best way to fix shortages is to fix our parking regulations. And this bill offers a reasonable opportunity for towns and developers to ensure adequate parking for residents of a development without making the project unaffordable. One developer told me that he is mandated to have 2 parking spaces per unit, when in fact his apartment residents average about a half a parking space per unit, because many simply do not use cars these days. It's a different world out there today. So he was forced to provide 4 times as much parking as was actually being utilized by his tenants. That leads us to our one objection, and I'll turn that over to Bob.
Thank you. My name is Bob Quinn. I'm the CEO of the New Hampshire Association of Realtors, and we do consider this bill the most important in this legislative cycle in terms of protecting and expanding private property rights. But we do have one concern, and that is on page 4, starting on line 11, regarding the innovative land control changes. So our concern is that this would enable a community potentially require new developments, let's say 30%, to be income restricted in any development. That requirement in and of itself may be enough of a disincentive for a developer to even consider moving into that community. If they so chose to do that, they might be having to deal with a standard of demonstrating economic viability in order to reduce that 30%. Economic viability is not defined in statute. It appears that the determination would be made by a land use board, by the planning board. Planning board's expertise really is more in understanding the use or dimensional requirements and not understand financial requirements of a developer. Could they ask for the performer to be handed over in order to demonstrate and prove economic viability? So with that, we are concerned. Second part also, maybe just a little bit of confusion on our part. In Part 10.9, it states the voluntary commitment of the property owner. We're not exactly sure if something is mandated, what is the property owner voluntarily agreeing to? So some clarification there would be helpful. Having said that, we do think 538 is a fantastic bill, and we hope you support it.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you. Of the whole bill, and I agree, again, with a lot of it, Section 7, dealing with minimum lot sizes. I agree with what you said. My question is, and let's be frank, this is the dragon in the bill. Taking away the ability of local towns to determine minimum lot sizes, many of which do this for exclusionary purposes. I lived in Bedford for 10 years. That's a town that loves big lots, specifically because they don't want people moving in from Manchester, and they've told me this, and developing, and they want to keep Bedford, Bedford. That's the way they put it, to be frank. And I can be a bit blunt here because I no longer represent Bedford. So I'm to Manchester. I went the other way. Politically, this is very difficult to accomplish. What is your organization going to do to buttress those of us that do the right thing and try to accomplish this in the public sphere? Because we're going to get slaughtered politically when we vote for this. And I'll do the right thing regardless. I know it's the right thing. But I've got to convince my colleagues to do this. So what are you going to do to support us?
Thanks, Bob. So I think that if you want to keep Bedford, Bedford, or any community itself, then you should be supportive of this legislation because this encourages construction more densely. As opposed to having 2-3 acre lots, which inevitably lead to sprawl throughout a community. This encourages a private property owner to potentially add more units on smaller lots. And I think that's the way that you can continue to protect and enhance the rural characteristics of any community. The state has granted the authority to municipalities to, in essence, we see it, remove private property rights, right? Towns only have the authority to do what the state grants them to do. So what this bill is attempting to do is give a little bit more authority and rights back to the property owner to do on their property as they best see fit. So that's kind of would be our argument in favor of this bill to those folks.
Senator Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I live in the community in Salem, which I think we're leading the way in housing development. I take a lot of pride in that. With that being said, some of the surrounding communities I know, and this has even happened in Salem from what I understand, is that they reject municipal services because they don't want to fall into this qualification. By having water and sewer, they feel that they'll be subject to these zoning requirements. So they'll reject any progress, I guess, in regards to, you know, utilities that are made available to them through the municipality, just to avoid falling into that. So in a good world, it would be great to still put them on town sewer, town water, because Windham, for example, half of our town reservoir, Candy Lake, is Windham, and all those houses have septic, and you know that's not good for the Salem's drinking supply. However, they keep time and time again that community's rejected municipal sewer and municipal water, and the reason is you hear is the fear of development or being forced into zoning ordinances like this. So how will we balance that? Because what the problem I'm going to run into is exactly that issue, where we have a large regional water project that's being in the works, but if you put something like this in the mix, I wouldn't be surprised if that project lost a lot of support.
I can give you an example of naming towns. Looking back in the past 3 years. So a town like Lebanon, a lot of demand for housing, and Ben knows this, up in the Upper Valley, as a result of the hospital and some developments, commercial development in that area. Lebanon has increased, the past 3 years, permitted 10% increase in total housing units. Next door, Hanover, less than 0.5% has been. So we've talked to folks in Lebanon, and they have expressed concerns that, hey, we're trying to do the best we can to accommodate the demand for housing in order to promote and support the economy in this area, to give workers and families the opportunity to live here. There are towns nearby who are not doing their fair share of ensuring that housing is available. I think that's where, in that manner, maybe the state has a responsibility to ensure that communities across participating and ensuring the opportunity for the owners to add the housing that is required and is being demanded of.
Follow-up?
Mr. Chairman, I understand the concept that not every community is doing what Salem did. The key, I guess the biggest concern is when you put a requirement like this, for the 10,000 square feet, for a single-family residential use, if you're subject to the municipal water and municipal sewer. The problem is that a community, like a section of town in Salem or Windham, Pelham, some of the surrounding communities, they'll reject the municipal services, the water and sewer, to avoid this. And I guess my point is, by having that provision in here, I mean, at the local level, it could be potentially sold where it's not, maybe not 10,000, but I know in North Salem, they're not on municipal water in that part of town, but it's a 2-acre lot requirement. If you ever made that a 1-acre lot requirement, would that still have a significant increase in housing that can develop in that area? Of course. But at the same time, if you make it 10,000, you might have a hard time getting water up there and sewer. Do you understand the point I'm making? So is there any suggestion maybe of removing that provision?
I don't know. I don't know about a suggestion. I mean, there always could be a compromise to it. You know, we're seeing that. I mean, you're seeing it, right? We're seeing it up in the Upper Valley, and the same thing about Bedford. I live in New London, and we'll call New London Bedford North, because they have the same opinion, right? We want to restrict building in our communities. So maybe there could be a compromise for that. I understand exactly what you're talking about.
Thank you.
Additional questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Nat Grace?
That's gonna be tough. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and H. Grace for the Municipal Association. I do have a hard copy of the letter I uploaded last week. Obviously, this is quite a large piece of legislation, so we have mixed feelings on it because there are various parts. As you might imagine, we do object to Section 7 with the minimum lot size. It sounds like the sponsor is working with a group of individuals to see if there's a amenable compromise that's possible, and I'm certainly happy to volunteer to work on that. As I outlined in my letter, you know, I just think feasibly it would be very difficult to accomplish what is being sought here for Section 7, as obviously I have a different opinion on the value of local control than some others, and I think that it is very valuable. So that's really the basis for a lot of our objection in addition to the feasibility. I did want to address a couple of sections that have come up. We do support Section 9, the inclusionary zoning. That is something that the City of Portsmouth has asked for several times. It may be the case that some adjustment is needed in terms of the units, but clearly the policy here is to allow municipalities to try to encourage workforce housing. And one of the things we've seen in development is that there are a number of incentives for market rate development, but not as many for workforce housing. So the hope is that by providing an enabling statute, we'll be able to provide more of that workforce housing, which is what the businesses downtown are calling for quite frequently. I also want to address Section 6 here, or kind of 4 into 6, which is the local option for non-charter towns to allow their zoning or their select boards to act on zoning. So the only other state that does this, as far as I'm aware, is Vermont. It's fairly new over there. The approach here is different in that it is a local option. There would have to be a vote at town meeting, and it's only for non-charter towns because, of course, as you all know from the discussion last year on charter towns, many of charter town, in the process of deciding whether to go with a charter, the voters of the town do vote on whether or not to retain zoning authority. Same thing as with when they go to a city. So that's why this is narrowed down to a very small number of towns. I guess a large number of towns, but a very small sliver of options under the statute. So that's how we would see that operate. And I'm happy to answer any questions the committee may have on
Questions
any of my
from the
testimony.
senators? Senator Abbas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I keep bragging about the great town of Salem because we just had a workforce housing project finally be completed, and I think residents will be moving in very shortly, if they haven't already. That was sold at the local level by the developer. Went on the ballot at the local level. The voters, the community bought into it, and therefore it has the community support. So as that building's being developed, it's clear that the community committed to that project. What's going on in the other communities that no developers can sell this at the local level? I'm not clear I understand this is well-intended here, but I just see they're having trouble at the local level selling this idea in other towns. So what's the holdup?
Well, I don't represent developers, so I can't speak as to their inadequacy in their ability to sell their projects to the community. But I would say I think that Salem, obviously I'm familiar with that project. They had a lot of buy-in. I think that's the right approach, and that demonstrates the value of local control.
Thank you.
Additional questions from senators? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Portsmouth Chamber, Ben Kump.
Morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Ben Van Camp. I'm the president of the Chamber of Commerce in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. We represent about 730 local businesses and about 20,000 employees. Those businesses are struggling. Those businesses are at a competitive disadvantage because their employees and their potential employees can't find a place to live. There are many pieces of this legislation that's been gone through quite extensively today, so I won't go into that. But you need to know that there's something for a lot of communities in this bill. There's things that work for Portsmouth. There's other things in this bill that won't impact Portsmouth very much. The beauty of this bill is that it has something for everyone. I encourage you to, just to demonstrate the scale of our challenge in Portsmouth. It's been long known that it's been hard as a member of our service industry, which is so vital to our tourism economy in Portsmouth, that's been hard to find a place to live in Portsmouth. Many of those people commute 45 minutes or more to come and serve in our restaurants and work in our hotels, and that's a hard burden for somebody on those wages. The problem over the years has gotten worse. Now teachers, nurses, firefighters, first responders can no longer afford to call Portsmouth home. They also have to commute 45 minutes or more to the seacoast for those jobs. To further demonstrate the severity of the situation, Portsmouth Regional Hospital is having a hard time filling doctor positions. Because if you are on a team that has to activate and you have to be within a certain drive of Portsmouth Regional Hospital, you cannot find a place to live as a doctor. The situation is severe. Just this past weekend, big article in the paper, 360 new units being built on a former what was it, a Bed Bath & Beyond, thank you, site. 360 units, great. All housing is good housing, right? None of those units are affordable. And we see that time and time again. The community of Portsmouth and other communities on the seacoast have built thousands of housing units over the last 5 years. Very few, less than 100 or 150, are affordable units. And that's our big challenge. The economics are not there for developers to do this willingly. And we need tools in our toolbox that help give our community the tools it needs to help developers along this path to building affordable units. Thank you.
Questions? Senator Abbas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know you mentioned some workforce shortage. Any shortage when it comes to the seasonal employees?
Oftentimes, seasonal employees find short-term solutions, and there are some of those. They're 4 or 5, 6 people in a 3-bedroom apartment, and you can tolerate that for a season. If they're a J-1 visa worker that's in from another country, that employer has to provide them housing. That's part of that arrangement. So we have companies and corporations buying up housing for those J-1 visa students that are visiting and working for the season. And they work hard. They work 2 jobs, so they're not really concerned about a quality of a place to sleep. They just want to rest their head and go back to work because they're trying to send as much money back as possible. So it is a challenge, but oftentimes they figure that out. It's the long-term solutions that are the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you.
Additional questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ben Frost, New Hampshire Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, committee members. My name is Ben Frost. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and Chief Legal Officer for New Hampshire Housing, and I'm here to express our enthusiastic support for Senate Bill 538. Most of my comments will be focused on Section 7, but I have a couple things to say about other sections of the bill, so I'll deal with those first and then return to Section 7 to wrap up. First off, this is really important legislation. I think you all recognize this and have said that. Others before me have also said that. Focusing on the first 2 sections dealing with RSA 79E, keep in mind this is a local option. RSA 79E was adopted by the legislature in 2006 and has become one of the most important tools that developers have in communities that choose to adopt its provisions. It is voluntary, it's enabling legislation. This bill, sections 2 and 3, add to the power of that already powerful law and would give developers additional options in those communities that choose to adopt it. I really appreciate the suggestions of expanding it to other commercial uses. We've seen changes in the market, both in office space, certainly, as people have, the work environment has changed and more people are working from home, so that has created vacancy in office space. Likewise, retail is changing, so there's vacancy, heightened vacancy in retail areas. So there's, I think, great opportunity for doing that there. This bill, sections 2 and 3, are structurally similar to the existing provision in the law, RSA 79E 4B, which is the residential property revitalization zone, but this focuses on office spaces and possibly other commercial uses as well. Turning next to sections 5 and 6, which you've already discussed at some length with others. Suffice it to say, this gives municipalities an option. It is up to the voters in the first instance to decide whether they want to do this. It's not something that's being foisted upon the voters. The voters will choose, do we want to do this? And if they do, then it provides an opportunity to make more expedient changes to zoning and really makes towns in that respect somewhat more like cities. Because where you have the local legislative body and the local governing body as the same body, things can happen faster in cities. Senator Abbas, you talked about the Depot and Main project in Salem, which is a project that we financed and one that we're very proud of. I spoke at the groundbreaking for that. I spoke with then Planning Director Ross Maldoff, and he reminded me that that development was made possible only because of a grant we had given to the town of Salem under our inclusionary zoning implementation program that got the town to change its zoning to allow that sort of development. But let me focus on how long that took. The town changed its zoning, I think, in maybe 2010, maybe 2009, maybe 2011. That's around the time we were running that grant program. Actually, it may have been earlier than that, maybe in 2007 or 8. So 15 years it took for a developer to be able to use that. These things take a long time. This would allow municipalities that are affected by it to choose to have a fast for changing their zoning. So for that reason, we endorse it. I will come back to Section 7. Section 8, we've not talked a lot about, but I think it's a great idea regarding parking. Parking, I think Ben Cushing or Bob Quinn said that parking is one of the most important cost drivers in development. And so if there's an opportunity while meeting a municipality's parking requirements to find some innovative alternatives to where the parking goes, then we're strongly in support of that. With regard to Section 9 of the bill, the inclusionary zoning provision, this builds upon existing law. Currently, our law is structured to allow municipalities to adopt voluntary inclusionary zoning, meaning a municipality can come up with an incentive to a developer, a voluntary incentive to induce them to do affordable housing, but they can't make them do it. This provides municipalities the flexibility with certain constraints, certain provisions, the percentages, and we can discuss those provisions. But it gives the municipalities the option of saying, under these conditions, you will do it. And these conditions are pretty limited. We haven't talked, and you haven't talked yet about subparagraph 3, which is page 4, lines 26 through 29. This is an extraordinarily powerful measure. And I encourage you to give that really due consideration, because giving planning boards the flexibility to waive certain provisions of zoning that impede the economic viability of a project is important. And I do want to focus on that term, because economic viability is undefined here, but it is a term that planning boards are familiar with. The same term is used in the workforce housing law, which was adopted by the legislature in 2008. And it occurs at RSA 674:58, Roman 3. And that's the definition of what reasonable and realistic opportunities are under the workforce housing law. It gets to economic viability of projects. That is, can a developer under the town's zoning ordinance do a project that is profitable? That's economic viability. That's what that means. And yes, in these circumstances here in this legislation, it would give a planning board an opportunity to inquire of a project's finances. This is something that they're already doing with workforce housing, so it's not a foreign concept. Let me now return to Section 7 of the legislation, which is the so-called, well, I've been calling it soil-based lot sizing. Others call it science-based lot sizing. Both are accurate because it utilizes the notions of soil science. It is based in science. And this, and Senator Murphy, I think you called this out as perhaps the most impactful portion of this legislation. I think you're right. And it is one that I think makes really good sense. First off, it applies only to a majority of the areas in a municipality that are zoned for single-family uses. What that means is that everywhere else, 49%, if you will, of a municipality's single-family zones are left to a municipality's discretion as to what to do with them. That is a significant portion of any municipality. So it's not saying you're going to do this everywhere. This legislation simply says in a majority of those areas, leaving a very large portion of any municipality up to municipal discretion to decide what they want to do. What that does is it helps municipalities rely on good master planning and good zoning drafting to decide how are we going to protect important natural resources, how are we going to conserve lands, how are we going to deal with prime agricultural lands, and other things, other areas that a municipality wants to protect. They can put those in that 49% and say, whatever size lots you want to require, that's up to you. It's just in a majority of the single-family zone areas do this soil-based lot sizing. This relies on standards already adopted by the Department of Environmental Services, and you see the citation there to their administrative rules. It has really detailed standards guiding how to size properties based upon their capacity to safely dispose of septic waste and provide clean drinking water for the occupants of that land. I have heard elsewhere some concerns about the predictability of this. Well, you know, zoning, 2-acre zoning is easy because you can just open the book and say, oh, 2 acres. Well, no, because if you are going to be actually subdividing land, you can look at the zoning and it says 2 acres, but you're still going to need to go to DES and get a subdivision permit, which will require soil-based analysis, precisely what this legislation is calling for. The standards that DES has vary depending upon the quality of the soils, the slope of the land, depth to bedrock, and other factors. And what they do is they yield a lot size, as I said, that will safely accommodate a septic system and a drinking water well. Under the best possible circumstances, which are unusual, it would yield a lot that is as small as 2/3 of an acre. And I say that's very unusual because those are the best soils with low slope, adequate drainage, but not too much drainage, so it's just right. It's like Goldilocks and the porridge. And so those are unusual circumstances. Typically, there'll be maybe an acre, maybe less, maybe more, maybe 2 acres. In some cases, depending upon the soils and slopes, it'll be 3 or more acres. We did an analysis of the impact of this legislation using the tools available to us through the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas, and found that this would roughly, statewide, roughly double the capacity to do starter homes, if you will, because smaller lot sizes means an opportunity to do less expensive homes. But that analysis includes areas where there's not really a strong market and you're not likely to see development. So the impact on any particular community is likely to be modest. And in Bedford, for example, Senator, I used to live in Bedford, lived there for 10 years, so I'm very familiar with the town. And I think that the impact on Bedford is probably pretty limited because Bedford is already pretty well built out under its current zoning. You'd be talking about subdividing existing parcels of land. If you've got a homeowners association, the association's probably going to say no, so it's not going to happen. If you've got configurations of lots that simply don't accommodate subdivision, it's not going to happen. I think the impact likely would be very modest, even in a place like Bedford. So I think that is all of the comments I have on this. I would be happy to take any questions.
Questions from the
Mr. Chair.
Senator? Senator Abbas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, you heard my comments about the issue with lot sizes and how that can be problematic, but I don't know if you have any comment on that concern I raised to previous members of the public who testified.
And Senator Abbas, you're referring to specifically page
3,
Page
lines
3.
3 to 6.
3 to 6,
And
the sewer question.
And what happens is, and I've heard this, that communities or neighborhoods and communities, they are rejecting municipal services to avoid falling under these provisions. So if a community adopted this, and then you try to tie them into a town sewer or town water, they're overwhelmingly rejecting it. So I guess that doesn't help. That doesn't help the situation because sometimes there's other environmental issues at stake here that you can't resolve. You have a lot of issues with well contamination, stuff like that, and people rather deal with the well contamination on their own than have the benefit of the municipal utilities. So I'm not saying I agree with that, but that's what's happening at the ground level. So I guess how do we balance that if you have a provision like this in the legislation?
Well, I thank you, Senator. I would echo the comments from my friends at the New Hampshire Association of Realtors. And I think that it is a matter of public communication and educating people about what this would mean. The fact is, on sewer, a 10,000 square foot lot is a pretty generous lot size. Even if you have a private drinking water well, you still, you need a 75-foot radius for protection for a well. That's to protect it from septic system, but you're on sewer. So you have some more flexibility. But even there, if you had, even counting for a 75-foot radius, you need a lot that's, maybe something on the order of 6,000 square feet. So 10,000 is pretty generous. And this doesn't directly address your question, Senator, but it is I think, a principle of taxpayer economics. And that is, we should not be making investments that are going to be inefficiently utilized. And I'm talking about, adding to sewer lines. These are really expensive projects, and they're paid for by taxpayers. Either, well, both, typically directly through a municipality bonding or direct appropriations, but also the state revolving fund through DES, which the legislature makes appropriations to. To put sewer on properties that the zoning says is a 2-acre minimum is a fabulously inefficient use of taxpayer money because it's so incredibly inefficient. And I'll say, from my perspective, we should not be doing that. We should be utilizing our infrastructure the most efficient way we can, recognizing certain principles of neighborhood development and community design. But if we're saying, let's sewer these 2-acre lots, that's just a waste of money.
Follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess the issue is we'll use a part of Salem, North Salem, right? They have a 2-acre lot requirement, no municipal services, at least the majority of North Salem. I know 10,000 square feet would be, so I'm presuming would be not popular in that part of town. But maybe 1 acre would be easier to sell, which we're talking, give or take, about 45,000 square feet. I mean, that's still, there's still new developments in that part of town that have been developed in the last couple of years. And I think if you'd made it that number, I guess having that number in there creates a lot of controversy, but perhaps taking that provision out, and you've got to trust communities to do the right thing. Because if you want them to buy into this, part of it is selling it to the communities at the local level. And I think having that in there, I already know that municipal services were rejected by North Salem once already. And now they have contamination issues, obviously with Arlington Pond, the cyanobacteria problem. And how are you going to resolve that? Part of it is the septic problem. So, but 10,000 square feet might be a tough sell. So the idea is getting communities to buy in, the more the better. But maybe we're asking for too much with 10,000.
I don't think I can help you specifically with your local question, but I understand the point. And I think that a good education campaign can go some ways toward addressing that. Maybe not enough in North Salem, I don't know. I do, and it's been suggested to view A and B separately, and I do encourage you to do that. There is some slight overlap that can easily be addressed through an amendment. If you were to strike B, let A stand.
Okay, any additional questions? I have questions. Page 4, line 36, I object to the word waive there. Waiving of requirements is a zoning board function, not a planning board function. If a planning board wants to do something, they need to do it as a conditional approval process. So I think that the word waive in there, leads us down a path that I don't need to go. And I need to talk more about, like I say, conditional approval and not, because they can invoke or not invoke something based on a condition. I'll ask the second question. A community on Route 16 north of here came in and testified in several bills over the last couple of years that Airbnbs are the thing that's causing them all of their problems. Certainly I've heard the same thing about Portsmouth. How, in your opinion, is the prevalence of Airbnbs causing this situation of housing to affordable housing to be a bigger problem than it should be. Exacerbate, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me address your first question first, and that is with regard to page 4, line 26, the word waive. You are correct that it is the jurisdictional domain of the Zoning Board of Adjustment to grant variances under appropriate circumstances. And the word waive here is not foreign to planning boards, because planning boards do have the authority to include in their regulations, site plan regulations and subdivision regulations, waiver provisions. In fact, I think in subdivision they're required to have a waiver provision. And there's 2 different standards for waivers of those regulations. Those are regulations that the planning board itself adopts, not town meeting or the local legislative body. Here, this in effect extends that capacity of the planning board to grant those sorts of waivers also to zoning, but limits it to questions where the economic viability of a project is being impaired by those provisions for waivers that are sought. That said, I think your suggestion of a conditional use permit for that is something really well worth exploring. Your second question, short-term rentals. It's a fascinating thing to study, and we have in fact studied it at New Hampshire Housing. We published a report less than a year ago, I would say the springtime, on the impact of short-term rentals statewide. And we also went down to the county level. It's much more difficult to get to specific municipal impacts because the data, the margins of error just become too great. So it's not, the data are not really that reliable. Among the things we found was that there did not seem to be, at least on a statewide or on a county-by-county basis, a significant increase in the numbers of short-term rentals, comparing them to what the census calls seasonal, recreational, and occasional use, SRO. So looking at the historical census data, even for places like Belknap and Carroll counties, there does not seem to be a dramatic increase in the numbers of those SROs, seasonal, recreational, and occasional use properties, which are the sorts of things that you would expect to be short-term rentals. We do, however, acknowledge that, and we also found that the existence of short-term rentals, going back to the launch of the online platforms around about 2014, and they existed before that, but they really took off in 2014, does not at this time seem to have impacted the prices of rentals. It does seem to have affected, in some places, the vacancy rates. So we're trying to figure out why vacancy rates but not prices. We don't have a really good answer for that, except that maybe there's a time lag in the impact on prices. So we acknowledge that the individual communities may be significantly impacted, including places like the town of Conway, if I got the town right, or Guilford or Alton, places that have really high tourism amenities. I live in Warner. There was a kerfuffle over short-term rentals a couple of years ago. It turns out we had 6 in town. It's not really impacting the market, but maybe impacting a neighborhood, and that's really a concern too. So at this time, the data do not suggest that short-term rentals have had an enormous impact on the market, but it may vary from town to town.
Senator Travis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've seen different bills of this nature. Any thought on why mobile home parks are, I understand the reputation they have, perhaps, isn't necessarily a fair classification. Some of the newer ones I've seen are basically luxury living, but how come?
I'm sure you meant manufactured housing communities.
In that. I wanted to make sure the public understands.
Senator Abbas, thank you so much for that question. Manufactured housing, what we used to know as trailers or other names, is really contemporary construction is of very high quality and endures, and in fact maintains or increases in value. So they become